Don't trust everybody. But I felt safe because she was with Brian, and I felt like she would be okay. I thought he would take care of her.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at the implications of Brian's chameleon personality. A social chameleon knows how to put their real self on hold, to move who they really are to one side in order to get a particular outcome. But there can be a nasty side effect to this sidelining of self, a propensity in psychology known as self-negation. Self-negation is a little bit like self-deprecation. It is to render oneself ineffective or invalid. Who wants to do that? Who wants to self-negate within an argument? Who wants to self-negate in terms of one's own wishes, needs, values, or importance? One way to follow and understand how this process works in reality is to study the opening scenes of the Moab incident. Brian behaves in a certain way that enhances his impression with the cops, whereas Gabby behaves in a different way, also a more authentic way, which leaves the cops to make up their own mind. When exposed to both Gabby and Brian, the cops are left with a better impression for Brian, who appears more balanced, who appears more in control of himself and his temper, and who appears less stressed, when that may not have been truly the case at all. Does that make sense? Social chameleons are often charming, and let's face it, it's better to have this trait to fit into different social situations than not to have it and then to fail at fitting in. Interestingly, not long after Brian Laundrie's school pal came forward, anonymously, a 31-year-old former co-worker at a garden centre in Long Island, Michael Livingston, stepped up to provide more intel on the Brian he knew. I'm pleased that we have a relatively older person making this assessment on Brian. Livingston is 8 years Brian's senior, rather than someone younger who may still be misinterpreting social cues. In the first two paragraphs of the article featuring Livingston's view of Laundrie, so much more is revealed about the other Brian. As always, I'll put the source material, the link to the interview from Fox News dealing with Brian's colleague, in the description. But before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed, please do. You can click on the light blue icon on the bottom right of your screen, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So the first thing I want to highlight are the words clean hands from the article. That was the thing that stood out to me. And it was from the following text from the article, quote, Brian Laundrie had the personality of a chameleon who sometimes lost his temper and always had clean hands despite working with plants and soil, according to a former co-worker from his native New York. He never came across as the kind of person that would be the killing type. Michael Livingston, who said he worked with Laundrie 23 in parts of 2017 and 2018, told Fox News Digital. But he did have that tendency to be, I don't want to say the wrong thing and make him sound worse than he already is. He was kind of a guy who would get pissed off pretty quick, end quote. Many of us think we know the killing type on sight, but in reality, there are criminals among us, and all of us are capable of inhumanity towards our fellow man, various levels of inhumanity. So there is no type. There's no type that one can recognize. In fact, I've recently heard that someone I knew from school, someone just a year younger than myself, has just been arrested for kidnapping. What stands out in the description that I've just provided is Brian always having clean hands. That's what stood out to me. It speaks to me about someone who is OCD, someone who's fastidious about certain things. Perfectionists aren't only hard to live with. They can struggle to meet their own standards. They can be hard to live with themselves. The other thing that we're seeing reinforced time and time again via different sources are Brian's apparent anger issues. What lies behind that? And that brings us to the second point, the weak silent type, question mark. You may be surprised to know that OCD often leads to anger. To be excessively controlling about everything in your life and even people means when these controls are violated, anger and sometimes fear is the result. One aspect that I don't think was properly recognized in the Chris Watts case was Shanann's OCD linked to Shanann's anger. Chris Watts was in a sense terrified of his wife and also terrified she'd find out about his affair. Nutgate provided a small clue about Shanann's propensity to anger, but the point is there's a link between anxiety, OCD, and anger. If you want to get rid of the OCD and the anger, get rid of the anxiety. If you want to get rid of the anger, get rid of the anxiety. If you want to get rid of the OCD, get rid of the anxiety. The underlying source of all of these things is anxiety that is failing to deal with reality. You are not adapting properly to reality. I'm sure there'll be some of you out there who don't like the term OCD, who will say that this is not the clinical diagnosis for OCD. Well, if you're one of those people, well then fill in the words more controlling over small details, those words, instead of OCD. But most of us know what we're talking about here. According to healthline.com, quote, a 2011 study founded that anger is a common symptom of OCD. It affects approximately half of people with OCD, right? So most people, around half the people who have OCD, have anger issues as well. Anger may result from frustration with your inability to prevent obsessive thoughts and compulsive behaviors, or from of having someone or something interfere with your ability to carry out a ritual, end quote. So if you know someone who's got ACD and you actually interfere with their little habitual things that they do to control their anxiety, you often bear the brunt of their anger as a result of interfering with this. Something you find silly, they find critical. Anger, and that's the end of the quote, anger can be an almost constant companion to someone who has OCD. So if someone has OCD and you spend a lot of time with that person, you're probably going to be spending a lot of time with their anger as well. It might be quite frustrating, having this constant anger to deal with. Well, and often it's quite irrational anger. What does one do with it? Well, go to the source of that, which is the anxiety. Easier said than done. Now back to the article. Quote, Livingston said he never witnessed Laundrie being mean or abusive to his now deceased former fiancée, 22-year-old Gabby Petito, but he did appear to be jealous if he spotted her talking to other guys. End quote. Now I'm not sure if that is very different from many other people. I was actually recently accused of not being jealous in a particular situation. So, it is fairly normal in a situation, especially with young people, to step up and be, well, this is my girlfriend or whatever. So I don't want to emphasize that point too much, except for the fact that Brian's jealousy has come up more often than not. So I don't think it's not a factor, right? To go back to the article, quote, he would come over and do the boyfriend thing, put his arm around her, give her a kiss, very possessive, he said, end quote. Note the word very possessive, not just possessive, not just jealous, but very. Now, one obvious reason Brian was likely possessive was because he knew on some level he wasn't good enough for Gabby, or feared that she might suspect he wasn't. And of course, there's also the social pressure that he had in high school, where he was made to feel not good enough as it was. And that brings us to the third point, identity in crisis, with a question mark. And I found some really interesting information in an almost 40-year-old article in the New York Times, describing the psychology of the social chameleon, but it leaves out, I feel, a very important facet. We often see this chameleon trait in ordinary young people who are trying to be who they need to be, who they feel they need to be. And you also see the chameleon trait in immature adults. I'd say that Laurie Vallow qualifies across the span of her 5 marriages for that particular label. I also think Chris Watts was trying out his chameleon outfit during his confessions and his long discussions with law enforcement, only to find out he was a very low self-monitoring individual, and thus wasn't very good at it, wasn't very good at the chameleon thing. Going back to this article in the Times, quote, "A person can realize that he is overly concerned about the impression he makes to the extent that he may virtually cease to exist as a person of substance, or conversely, he can find himself so ungiving as to fail to connect with the outside world," end quote. Now, some of those descriptions do seem to be a match for Chris Watts, don't they? And a lot of people have compared Chris Watts to Brian Laundrie. Which one of these personas do you think was Brian? Think about the apologetic Brian during the Moab incident and the pissed off Brian during the Mary Piglets incident. And what sort of person is Brian communicating during his sermon about the juniper tree? A person who either feels himself failing to exist as a person of substance or failing to connect to the outside world experiences by default, by definition, social death. If this is felt strongly enough, if it awakens a crisis of self, a crisis of an identity under siege, that is, an identity that doesn't actually exist, that hasn't actually been fully formed or properly formed, well, there may be an existential crisis, a kind of a critical existential crisis, a perception that the symbolic self is under severe threat. And that can actually feel like you are facing actual peril, imminent peril, right? This can lead to a lashing out at someone whom the impinged self feels is to blame. And that brings us to the 4th point. Why did Gabby settle? And that's a word that is used by Livingston in the interview. He said, quote, "I think the only reason why she settled for him," meaning Gabby settling for Brian, "is he wanted to travel," Livingston said, end quote. I don't think that's the only reason Gabby settled for Brian. I think he had a soft, kind, considerate side, and I think she was drawn to his artistic talent. They had that in common. I do think Gabby, and I also think they were fairly quiet people, both of them, to some extent. I do think Gabby settled when a pattern of tantrums began to manifest, and Gabby decided to put up with it in order for the adventure to run its course. Now, we do know that that had a lot of arguments previously, according to, I think her name's Rose Davis. And the problem is, if really bad arguments happened during this van life episode, what are you going to do? You're relying on this person that is also perhaps to some extent emerging as your enemy or as a problem. Well, you can't just you can't run away from them because, they are in charge of your transport. So there was a lot of difficulty for Gabby in extricating herself from a situation that was by its very nature to some extent a mutualistic, symbiotic kind of relationship where they were working together towards a common outcome. So it's quite difficult to extricate oneself out of that. And she may have felt a very strong sense that she wanted to complete the journey. She wanted to make it work no matter what. You really got that sense strongly during the Moab incident. Do you agree? I do think one gets a strong sense of this when the cops tell Gabby that she's got to appear in court in that moment. And despite what has just taken place between herself and Brian, Gabby's determined to continue with their project. She really wants to make it work. She doesn't want it to be a failure. So in a very real sense, Brian may have felt secondary to Gabby's project. In other words, the project is the most important thing. It's more important than Gabby. It's more important than Brian. It's more important than anything else. And Brian may not have liked that. He may have felt like a pawn in Gabby's project. And if you've used someone else's pawns in your project, for example, as a salesperson, that may feel very invalidating. And so that was the question. I wonder whether that was going on in Brian's mind. And that brings us to the fifth point, intertextualities. One of the biggest insights from Michael Livingston is this other role we see Brian in, that of a salesman. Sales often comes up in true crime, whether it's the perpetrator or the victim. A few examples include Scott Peterson, who was a failed fertilizer salesman, Jody Arias, and by the way, also Travis Alexander. They were both multi-level marketing sales folk working in insurance. Shanann Watts, multi-level marketing sales in wellness products. Amanda Knox in bar sales at the time of the events there. And then John Ramsey, in the John Benet Ramsey case, he was involved in computer sales. His wife was actually involved in marketing, which is also the selling of, putting together sales messages. So Brian, as the salesman, for me, puts a completely different spin on his role in the Moab incident. In the article, Livingston compares Brian to the most stereotyped manipulators in sales of all, car salespeople. And this is a quote from the article. "He was a good employee who knew how to talk to people," Livingston said. "He knew how to make people like him. He knew how to make people happy. And he knew how to make people buy the product that he had, honest. He had the same kind of air you would be taught if you worked at a dealership," end quote. And I think when he says that, he's referring to a car dealership, right? A vehicle dealership. In many crimes, the same question comes up again and again. How did X think that they could get away with it? Well, sales is an area where someone may, quote, get away with it, unquote, pitching a story that's not necessarily true, but closing the deal regardless because the ruse has worked. Does that make sense? So if ordinary folk can be deceived, why not law enforcement? And that's what the salesperson might be thinking, right? And that brings us to the final point, the nasty downside. The nasty downside to being a chameleon. There is a cost to constantly being someone besides yourself. And now we once again revert to that article from the Times. Quote, "Such social chameleons who in every situation strive to make the best impression they can do so at a psychological cost," new research suggests. Well, in this case, it's now research that's 40 years old. To return to the article, quote, "Those who always try to be the right person in the right place at the right time," according to Mark Snyder, a social psychologist at the University of Minnesota, become extraordinarily attuned to the ways others react to them. They continually monitor their social performance, skillfully adjusting it just when they detect that they are not having the desired effect. End quote. But this skill at being a smooth operator can undermine the quality of intimate relationships. What happens when this salesperson goes home? What happens when this YouTube creator who's very good at manipulating their audience turns off the camera and has to relate to another person? What happens then? How good are they in intimate relationships? Going back to the article, quote, "Those who are most adept at making a good impression, paradoxically, tend to have less stable and satisfying intimate relationships, suffering in both the quality of their friendships and the stability of their romantic ties," end quote. So if Brian was a skilled social operator, I'm not sure if he learned much of that at school. Most of that seemed to happen outside of school, perhaps as a result of Brian's social failure, Brian being a social failure at school, certainly the perception that he was. It's possible that he decided to up the ante trying to fit into the working world. If he succeeded, then the whole van life thing seemed to indicate that it wasn't something he could maintain indefinitely, right? He preferred to be alone with Gabby than turning himself inside out as a salesman. Now, in the same context that it takes a thief to catch a thief, a social chameleon might be very paranoid within the context of an intimate romantic relationship that he's being used or manipulated because he's super sensitive to pouncing on opportunities to use and manipulate others. One can imagine the minefield that can be conjured by putting not only your travels but your relationship on social media for all to gauge and criticize. Let's go back to the article. Quote, he knew how to make people like him. He knew how to make people happy. He would come over and do the boyfriend thing, put his arm around her, give her a kiss, very possessive, he said, end quote. Well, how do you do that in the context of social media? How do you come over and do the boyfriend thing? How do you come over and, be very possessive? When what you're actually trying to do is sell yourself and your relationship and your daily doings to make a living out of that. So you can see how that could have been problematic. I think Brian felt he was getting somewhere in the social game only to be invalidated, usurped, superseded by Gabby in the social media game. When that made him anxious and insecure and angry, that put their relationship in jeopardy. And then he wouldn't have wanted to continue with the social media, which is exactly what we see, the social media petering out after the Moab incident. So think about it. Even when Gabby and Brian were in the spectacular scenery to punt their van life adventure, they didn't. Why do you think that was the case? I'm talking about when they were in the Grand Tetons. Why didn't they sort of brag about where they were? Why didn't they tell everyone? Why do you think that was the case? Who wanted to sort of share that and who didn't? And that brings us to the final point. How do you sell yourself, and how does your significant other do that without the chameleon becoming jealous and possessive? And if he does, who does he take it out on? And that brings us to the final quote from the New York Times article. Quote, although one might expect social chameleons to get along well with just about anyone, they seem to have trouble when they are in the company of those who are at the opposite extreme. In one study, William X, a psychologist at the University of Texas, paired people who scored very high and very low on the scale that measures self-monitoring. When two people who both scored high or both scored low were paired, they got along quite well, but not mixed pairs, end quote. Gabby and Brian were a mixed pair. Brian trying to fit in, trying to control an uncontrollable situation, that's the social media side of things, on the one hand, while on the other, Gabby's loyal and authentic, but taciturn. If Gabby's loyalty was changing, or if Brian suspected it was, under the jagged shadows of the Grand Tetons, then what did Brian have left to live for? So I'm not going to take it further than that. I still am going to be going further into the psychological life of Brian, and we're going to look at this whole way, how should one be a man kind of thing. And I think one approach is to be a chameleon, to be whoever someone wants you to be, and good luck with that. It's going to lead to anger issues. But there's another alternative, to be an authentic person and a badass as well. How does one go about that? That's going to be the subject of an upcoming video, so look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.